The New Garden is a podcast on technological power, promise, and peril. Technology is no longer just a set of tools. It's a force that shapes our desires, our communities, and even our theology. The New Garden explores what it means to live faithfully at a time when humanity can rewrite genomes, simulate consciousness, and manufacture joy with the push of a button. Drawing from Christian tradition and moral imagination, the podcast confronts the tension between what is possible and what might undo us. Each episode is a guided reflection on our age of godlike power, an invitation to discern how we cultivate this new garden without becoming the serpent in it. Hello and welcome to another episode of the New Garden podcast. Today we are talking AI grief, immortality, and resurrection. Our guest is Derek Schuurman. He is the professor and chair of computer science at Calvin University. So he brings a deep Christian theological perspective, and also he's a computer science expert. And in a topic where it is often hard to draw the line on where are we excited about technology advances and then where do we get worried, Derek has a strong perspective and draws red lines. So this was a super interesting conversation. Derek shared very vulnerably about his own journey with grief and his processing in a theological perspective. Hope you enjoy, as always, the New Garden podcast. Thank you. All right, Derek, thank you very much for joining us on the New Garden podcast.
Yeah, great to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
I think you are our first guest who started as an electrical engineer and then got an advanced degree in robotics, professor of computer science, and then also integrating that with a deeply Christian theological perspective. Can you share a little bit on your background and how you brought two of those together in your vocation?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I grew up at the era of the first personal computers in the 1980s and really delighted in technology. I became a ham radio operator and played around with electronics and went on to study engineering and at a large state university, provincial university in Canada, actually. And I was a Christian. I was raised in a Christian home, went to Christian school, and just delighted in electronics, and then eventually ended up in industry, working as an engineer, designing embedded systems. And it was only then that I began to think about, my world and life view as a Christian and my work as an engineer and how to put those two pieces together. They seem to live in different worlds, and I didn't really know how to connect the dots. And so that began sort of a process of thinking about, connecting faith and my work in engineering. Eventually, I discerned a call to teaching and went back for a PhD in electrical engineering and ended up teaching at a small Christian liberal arts university in Canada, where it became my job to articulate, the connection between faith and computer science and technology more broadly. And I really relished that because I was motivated personally by figuring that out. And in that context of a small Christian liberal arts university, I had the opportunity to have conversations with professors and theologians and philosophers and social scientists and people who had been thinking for a long time about Christian worldview and about faith integration and about how the gospel speaks to all of life, and grew as a Christian scholar as a result, which I continue to this day at Calvin University, where I'm currently teaching in computer science. So it's an ongoing thing, but that's how it started. Yeah.
Thank you. And we were originally referred to Derek by another guest, Matt Pryor, who said, if you're talking on this topic, you got to get Derek Schuurman. I've heard him speak. He knows it back and forwards. And this episode was originally called AI, Immortality, and Resurrection. And it wasn't until Derek and I met each other and he shared his story that it became grief, immortality, and resurrection. And Derek, I appreciate how you have shared publicly about the journey of losing your wife. And I'm hoping that you can give listeners a little bit of backstory and context there. And then we'll use that as a frame to get into some of the technology elements of this very human process of grieving.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I met my wife while I was still an undergrad, and actually met her at the small Christian liberal arts college that I later became a professor at. while visiting there on a weekend one time, and we got married while we were juniors, and were very much in love and sort of grew up together. We were 21 when we were married, and we raised four children together. And to be honest with you, she was an awesome encourager and companion through all of those years. I'm actually in Christian higher education in part because of her. I was working in industry and I was wrestling with integrating faith and my work as an engineer and felt this call to teaching, which we prayed about together. And then she nudged me and urged me and said, you know, if you really sense this call and I see those gifts in you, then you need to you need to pursue that. And so in our early 30s, when I had a mortgage and three children, she encouraged me to go back and get a PhD, which isn't a logical thing to do. And we made that leap of faith, and God provided along the way, and sort of is the reason why I'm here today. Without her support, I simply wouldn't be doing what I'm doing. About 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, she began to develop some puzzling symptoms, and after some diagnosis, we found that she had a very aggressive lymphoma. And of course, we rallied all our friends and neighbors to pray, and our church, and she walked that journey for about 8 months, and eventually, despite the best efforts of the doctors and the technology of the time, she passed away in December of 2023. So that hurled me into a world of grief that I'd never experienced before, and yeah, you're right. I have written a little bit about this too. There's an article that your listeners probably could stumble on online called "Lament for a Wife," where I kind of talk about that journey. But grief is no longer an abstract concept. I'd never really experienced grief to that extent before in my life, and it forced me to come to sort of a concrete realization of my own limits as a person and my own mortality, and to rethink the hope of the gospel, right? More than sort of academically, but personally within my own life. So that's a bit of a sketch. There's much more to the story, of course, but that was our story. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for sharing, and thank you for sharing publicly about that. I think it allows us to touch something in ourselves, and certainly it did in me when I read The Limit for a Life. And so I appreciate you being willing to discuss here. And I'm going to keep us on the technology angle because I think that's kind of our promise to listeners and what we're investigating. And I'm curious if there are ways that you found technology helpful or unhelpful in your grief process.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Of course, having a large folder full of digital images of our life over the years was helpful in remembering and recalling, with children and family as well, being able to give thanks for some really good times that we had together, and remembering when the kids were small, and places we had been and things we had done together. And so I found that helpful, the ability to sort of go back. And of course, that's not a new technology. Photographs have been around for a long time. Being able through technology to be able to communicate with family regularly. I'm in West Michigan. My family is all in Canada and in southern Ontario. And so being able to connect with them regularly was a gift of technology. Being able to connect widely with her family and relatives. Her funeral was streamed. She has roots in the Netherlands, and so was able to have family from there watch, and of course from Canada. So technology, I think, was a blessing in some ways, but I mean, it was not. It was not a silver bullet for my grief. I think what I found far more helpful was sort of the presence of people in my life that surrounded me and provided friendship and a listening ear, and especially others who had experienced grief. I found that I joined grief groups, which were a new experience for me. There's actually a program called Grief Share that's widely offered across U.S. and Canada, and I joined a local Grief Share group and was really able to wrangle with this new experience of grief that had sort of overtaken my life, and I found that far more helpful, actually.
Derek, when I was 16 years old and my father was 46, he was diagnosed with mesothelioma, died of asbestosis, cancer, lung cancer. And that was the catalyst for my own faith. I grew up Roman Catholic, had much more of a communal sort of shared faith, but faith became very personal to me. And I remember someone giving me C.S. Lewis's book, A Grief Observed, and there was continuity between what I read from your piece, Lament for a Wife, and that. And one of the things that struck me was something that Lewis wrote about how people would say to him, you know, she'll live on in your memory, or she'll live on in your heart. And he has this like really biting line after he mentions this and says, live, that's exactly what she won't do. Right? She's not alive. And he has this like way of saying, and I'm not going to get it verbatim, but where he says something to the effect like, if she was alive in my memory, it would be this sort of incest, right? Like this sort of, I want to hold that as I'm getting, as the part of the setup for the question. You know, we've talked on our podcast before about Yuval Noah Harari identifying like the quest for immortality as this like deeply human quest, and the gospel speaks to that. And I'm wondering how you're, like, since your wife's death, how you're navigating that space. Like this idea, like she won't live, the promise of the gospel, and then these like tools that are at our disposal, even that are going to develop beyond just like the photographs and the live stream, but maybe like interfaces and maybe like a rehabilitation of someone's consciousness on, like, how are you thinking about all that, maybe like personally, but also professionally too?
Yeah, no, that's a loaded question. I think part of going through grief is accepting the loss, you know, and I found that a lot of well-meaning friends and others, you know, at the receiving line of the funeral were trying to offer me helpful remarks. You know, she'll live in your heart, and, you know, heaven now has another angel, you know, these kinds of things, which weren't all that helpful, you know, and for me, you know, visiting her grave and being able, with the X-ray vision of my imagination, being able to picture her, you know, buried in the ground, is just a raw, you know, just a terrible thought, you know, of your loved one perishing, and, you know, the journey even up to the point of death, seeing someone diminish in all of their capacities and their body kind of giving out, is a terrible reality. I remember even talking to my pastor about this, you know, and you know, I was thinking about calling the funeral a celebration of life, and he said, well, you know what, that's good to celebrate life, but it's also a lament of of death and of dying, and you shouldn't, you know, soft pedal that. You need to kind of face that, and I thought that was an interesting comment. So, of course, for the Christian, it doesn't end there, right? The reality of death doesn't end there. We have, of course, the hope of the gospel. You know, we have Paul's words, right? That she's in a place that's better by far, and this hope of one day all things being made right again, and the resurrection, and living in a new heaven and a new earth. The words of the Heidelberg Catechism, question and answer 1, were ringing in my ears. Something I was forced to memorize as a teenager in catechism class came back. This notion that what is your only comfort in life and in death? It's that my faithful Savior, Jesus Christ, right? And body and soul and life and death, that I belong to him. And I found those words incredibly comforting and helpful at a time when, I felt completely helpless. And of course, I think that my experience is, of course, not a unique experience. It's part of universal human experience of facing loss and death and mortality. And so I think if, in the absence of a belief in a God, I think that the human impulse is to try and find a way forward, to try and find a solution. And of course, technology is one of the powers in our age where people seek to control the natural world and everything around them. And so you're right. There are people who are now constructing, grief bots and trying to, talk about the possibility of living an eternal life inside of a machine and downloading your brain into a computer. All of these sorts of things. And of course, I think all of those things are sadly mistaken in terms of what they presuppose about what it means to be human and about life and death. And so the gospel and my dependence on God actually grew as a result of going through all this, kind of realizing that, when we get to the end of our rope, which we all will at some point, that God is there to hold on to us. The Psalms became much more meaningful to me. I've read the Psalms throughout life, but of course, what does a 17-year-old know about, my tears being my food day and night? Psalm 88, darkness is my only friend. Thank God I had not experienced those things until just, in recent years, with the death of my wife. And God's promise, right, that he collects all of our tears in a bottle, that he cares about us, that he sees us, that we can express these sort of things to him. So God was not only a hope and an anchor, but also a person to turn to in my distress and in my grief, and I think we'll get into some of the technology later on, but, in contrast to other forms of hope that people put in technology and in transhumanism and posthumanism and these sorts of movements.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the Heidelberg Catechism. A moment of digression. I memorized the first question in German in a bar in Heidelberg when my wife was shopping. Was ist dein einziger Trost im Leben und im Sterben?
Yeah.
What is your only hope, comfort in life and in death? But let me just push like a little bit here, and I think we will get more into this. Is part of the hope, can part of the hope come through technological advancement? Like there's days, Derek, and I don't know if you feel this way, like there's days where I like wish that I had the technology to like have a conversation with my dad like we're doing right now. I have a son who's engaged to be married. He's going to wear my dad's wedding ring on that day. And that's beautiful and lovely, but wouldn't it be amazing if he could sit down like we're sitting down through an avatar and through all the collected memory that we had, where he could like speak words of advice to him, I mean, it makes me, I'm like emotional just thinking about that. Like there's part of me that like would want, like I just desperately want that. Like, do you want that?
Yeah, I mean, this is a human impulse, that by any means we can, to be able to kind of cling to our lost loved one. And what you're talking about is a grief bot of sorts, right? So there's now technology where you can glean all of the text messages and emails and documents of your loved one and use it to train and tune a chat bot so that it responds as if it were your loved one. And there actually is an industry that's grown around this, so that people can continue to talk to their loved one. Even their voice can be mimicked, and you can have this grief bot give you a call once in a while, which on one hand may seem appealing. It's a way to continue a conversation, but I think we have to see it for what it is, right? I mean, it is an echo, a shadow of reality. It's not real, it's not genuine, and I think as a human, we can actually get stuck if we don't face grief head on. I think grief is one of these things, and this is what I heard repeated in some of the grief groups, and it rings true, that it's something you can't go over, around, or under. It's something you have to go through. And Jerry Stitzer wrote a book called, A Grace Disguised, about his grief, right? And he said, actually, when the sun is setting, the quickest way to get to the sun is not to run towards the setting sun, but to run the other way into the darkness, into the dawn that's coming. And I think of that image, and I think it's really important. I think it's very easy to get stuck if you don't face your grief head on, with the help of community and people and family, of course, too. And I think some of these grief bots can actually get you stuck in not really facing up to the reality of a lost loved one, and to have a thin simulation of a relationship that may actually prevent you from having genuine relationships with those around you, and perhaps with God, turning to God. And so I think there's real dangers with that. And I think one of the things I always teach my students too is that, machines are machines and people are people, and we have to make sure that we don't get confused between the two, and not to use machines as if they're persons. Some of the latest research that's actually coming out about chatbots, which are being used in relationships all over the place now, and therapists, people are turning to them for all kinds of things, because they're actually quite charming and quite convincing. But some of the latest research is showing that actually when people turn to these things, they end up being more lonely. They end up having more social isolation. They actually have more trouble, which I think as Christians shouldn't surprise us. We're created to live in community with God and with other people. And if we go against that sort of creational norm, there's going to be consequences. And I think we're created to live in genuine community with God and with others, and a machine simply can't substitute for that. It is a completely other thing. There's a difference between someone and something. Even if something can convincingly mimic a person, there's no one home. So yeah.
So I found the C.S. Lewis quote, and this is on the unreliability of mental images. Images, I must suppose, have their use, or they would not be so popular, but they lie. Only the very greatest master of fiction could, I think, make me believe that the woman I remember is the same person as the woman who is dead. And that line, only the greatest master of fiction, it's like we might be heading towards great masters of fiction that we haven't really even conceived of previously, with the ability to have, a lifelike, seemingly embodied digital avatar. Mm-hmm. And so, Derek, I'm curious, would you contend that there is a helpful or entertaining or generative use of a grief bot or digital avatar, or are you drawing a pretty hard line there and saying that they're kind of always problematic? And if so, is your pastoral recommendation to anybody who's in clergy listening to this, that if someone comes to you and they're saying, hey, I'm thinking about using these, that you would advise them to steer clear?
Yeah. No, that would be absolutely my recommendation. In fact, I train computer scientists and we train our students at Calvin University in designing machine learning systems and AI and large language models. And the one thing I tell my students is, don't make machines that pretend to be people. I have an article online called "The Problem with Chatbot Personas." This idea of building chatbots that pretend to be people. And I coined this phrase, ontological confusion. We can become confused, the difference between a person and a machine. And I think that's a problem. If we believe that humans are uniquely made in the image of God, then we shouldn't try to build machines that try to pretend to be human. And I think there's going to be consequences. Like I said, some of the social science research is already showing that these machines that promise, connection and promise, to be a solution to loneliness actually exacerbate the thing. And we've seen this with social networking too, right? Right? Social networking promises widespread connection. And of course, if you push that to an extreme, you're actually, sitting alone in a basement with a glowing rectangle, and you're all alone. So I think it can actually get in the way, as I mentioned before, of dealing with grief in a healthy way. And I think it can actually interfere with real human relationships and how we relate to people. A relationship with a chatbot is a relationship of one person. It's all about you, actually, which is not a healthy way to interact or learn to interact with others.
Yeah, and you've said about the push for community, and I wholeheartedly agree with you, not just as a pastor, but as like someone who's personally walked through the grief journey and continues to walk by in my own right, and then walk with others. This ontological confusion, that's powerful. Um, One of the things that we've explored with other guests, and it's something that Brent and I talk a lot about, is sort of the mitigated experience. And like you mentioned earlier at the very outset of the podcast about the mitigated experiences that you have had that have, or benefits, the live stream, the photo album. And so I think I'm rehashing the question that Brent just asked you. And full disclosure, and we've shared this with other guests, we tend to be like positivists on technology. And in my own words, like I want to leave room that the kingdom of God can be entered and received through technological advancement. Um, so like, I mean, ontological confusion could happen even with the live stream or with the photo albums, right? I mean, and I'm not trying to, I'm not trying to be antagonistic here, but where's the line of mitigation? Like, where do you draw the line? Even like even our experiences in grief support groups have a certain level of mitigation, language, facilitation, like a facilitator, like, so is it the someone versus something for you still, or like, how do you know that that's the heart? How do you know that's the red line for you? Because everything's mitigated now.
Yeah.
Everything.
Yeah. No, our premise at teaching computer science and engineering is that technology, computer science, artificial intelligence is part of the latent potential in God's good creation. Already at the beginning of Genesis, when humankind, after they fell and they were exiled from the garden, we see God constructed for them clothing made out of animal skins, more durable than the leaves they had constructed for themselves, showing them, I think that shows God's mercy, showing a kind of technology, clothing technology, that could help them in their fallen state. But of course, the problem is when we turn to technology in place of God, and seek the solution to our fallen state through technology. I think medicine's in the same category. God has given us wonderful medicine, and my wife benefited from some of the treatments that were available that prolonged her life for a time and allowed her to live in a bit more comfort. And we were extremely grateful for that. That is a gift from God that maybe the way to say it pushes back some of the effects of the fall, but can no way ever overcome it. It's not a solution. And things like photographs and audio clips and movie clips of your loved one can be a wonderful gift, to kind of remember and celebrate, and basically give thanks to God for the gift of the person that He gave us. In my lament for a wife, I comment, that besides my life and my salvation, my wife Karina was the greatest gift that God gave me, and so these things, these objects, allow us to to remember. But I think the problem is when we substitute something in creation for God, right? That's essentially idolatry. Whenever we look to technology instead of Jesus for our ultimate hope, when our ultimate trust. And in fact, that goes back to the catechism again. What's your only comfort in life and in death? It's that I'm not my own, but I belong to my faithful
Yeah.
Savior, Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think technology is a gift of God that's latent in creation. It's always intertwined with the effects of sin, so we have to be attentive to that. And so we give thanks to God for that, but we never want to substitute a trust in God with a trust in technology. And I think that's where the red line is.
Yeah. Brent's going to follow up with a little transition here, but I can't help myself but to say, like, it's great talking to someone who is deeply reformed theologically about these things. Like when I teach a new members class at our church, I often say, Reformed Theology 101, God is God and you're not. And I think what you're also saying is God is God and the machine is not. So
Yes.
good stuff. Thanks, Derek.
Yeah, I'm curious, how do you orient towards the topic of death and the necessity of death? And you talked about some people downloading their consciousness, but even, we mentioned it is a core impulse of ours to want to delay death, to want to talk to people who are on the other side of death, to want to not die. But yet, Christians are promised this great hope through death and through the resurrection. Would I be a correct read to say, yes, let's embrace technology that extends life, but death is absolutely necessary and shouldn't be tried to be, avoided in any sense through technological innovation? And like, how do you navigate the death process?
Yeah. No, that's another great question in terms of our posture towards death. I think, I think the Bible's clear, that it's appointed once for man to die. That this is not something that we can overcome, and I think any attempts to try extending to try and overcome death, let's put it that way, are a fool's errand. I don't think it's possible. Now, like I said, due to the gift of technology, we're able to help people live more comfortably, more long than they might otherwise, in the absence of medications and antibiotics and treatments and so on. And I think we see that as a gift from God. But ultimately, I think there comes a time when we have to accept the fact that we're not going to be on this planet forever, and we have to let our loved ones go, and finding the right way and time to do that, and accept that. I think the impulse for some people is to just try to seek eternal life here on earth, right? And one of the most vocal proponents of this is Ray Kurzweil, right? And maybe I'm sure you've heard of him, right? He's got a book. He had a famous book called The Singularity is Near, and now he's got an update to it called The Singularity is Nearer. And basically he talks about, one day when we can reverse engineer the brain, when we've got enough computing power, we'll be able to download our brains into a computer and live in a virtual paradise forever. And that's his dream. And of course, that vision has presuppositions about what it means to be human. It means that if you can completely capture the electrochemical reactions in your head with enough fidelity and simulate that in a computer, you've captured the essence of what it means to be a human. And of course, as Christians, we look back to, the creation story already, right? That Adam is made from the dust of the earth. So we are made of the kind of stuff that plants and animals are. But there is also this additional ingredient of the breath of the Lord that's needed to animate us. There is a spiritual dimension. We see that in the vision of Ezekiel too, right? With the dry bones, they're kind of all assembled with flesh and sinew and organs, but they're still not animated until the Spirit of the Lord blows. And so I think that the presuppositions of people who think we can overcome death represent a reductionistic view about what it means to be human. It's a very materialist view about what it means to be human. We're far more complex than that. And I think this impulse goes, isn't a new one, right? Already in the Garden of Eden, right? The promise was, you shall be like God and you shall not surely die. And I think of Psalm 115, which talks about idols, right? Whenever we look to technology, as sort of our savior, we create an idol, of course. And Psalm 115 talks about those who make idols will become like them. And I think if you download your brain into a computer, you become a computer, essentially. So I think that this task, this research project, is seriously flawed because its presuppositions about what it means to be human are not based in fact, and it just shows this spiritual impulse. I mean, I think all of us are religious, whether we admit it or not, and Silicon Valley is animated by a religious vision of the good life. It's bringing, well, I think we'll get to this later, but it's trying to bring about a utopia, but without God. So those are some of my thoughts.
Yeah. Kurzweil, I'm listening to The Singularity is Near again during my workout routines, and I feel like I constantly have a boxing match between him and Calvin, like sort of the very things that you're talking about. And Derek, I'd so desperately want my cake and eat it too. Like I want both. Like but I what I appreciate more as we continue the conversation, what I appreciate a lot rather, as we get into the conversation more, is like identifying the impulse, like just like naming it, like this desire that it's a very human desire to want to live forever.
Yeah.
In the way that we understand life as it is. But I also, I hold that intention with like when Jesus says in John 10:10, like I've come to give you life and give it to the full. Like I think that also means here, like I'm not a, holy huddle, wait till you die kind of Christian. Like and this is why we pursue medicine, and this is why we pursue treatments to cancer and want to prolong life, quality of life, not just quantity of life. So I really appreciate you framing it the way that you are, like in this reformed kind of space, and the anthropological side to it, right? Like what is the essence of who we are? And that's for those who are Kurzweil devotees, and I would put myself on that list, I think that's a great corrective and a great insight about what he says.
Yeah, and I'll transition us to the Silicon Valley vision of utopia contrasted with the biblical picture of resurrection. And, Brian Johnson is another one that I listen to. He's got the Don't Die movement and interesting documentary on Netflix. And he grew up Mormon. And some of the ways that he talks about wanting to live forever and for as long as possible are rooted in a real reverence for life and some themes that I'm like, all right, I feel some overlap in what we're talking about here. And I'm curious, Derek, if you ever have the inkling of, I wonder if like the promise of resurrection and a new body and life eternal, like was actually something that we might engineer towards and have on this earth, or is that like totally separate and a perversion in your mind and you keep it completely separate? Like, do you ever have that wondering, and how do you navigate it when you do?
Yeah. I think I think a Christian eschatology is really important for understanding what we ought to be doing now. So
can you unpack that for us?
Yeah, I think our view of the future really impacts how we see what we ought to be doing and thinking now. There's these rival stories, right? There's sort of and each of these stories are worldview stories of a sort, right? And the technological sort of worldview is a story that I think is actually derivative of the biblical story, right? That this idea that we're actually heading somewhere, that there's this new Jerusalem, there is this new heavens and this new earth, is something that I think was co-opted, by people early on, and they basically took that biblical story that we're moving towards a new heaven and a new earth, and they basically thought that we could accomplish that without God. Because historically, a lot of worldviews have been seeing the world as sort of cyclical and not as linear, moving towards an end. And the biblical story has that picture. We're moving towards the new heaven and the new earth. The Bible begins in a garden and ends with this beautiful city. And I think people that the Enlightenment, Epicureanism, other movements have kind of said, God is either absent or he's not real, so it's up to us to usher in this New Jerusalem. And I think the Silicon Valley narrative, a lot of the impulses that drive Silicon Valley have that view of ushering in, a kind of utopia, as you mentioned. Mark Andreessen has this blog article called "AI Will Save the World." Right? There is, going back to the 17th century, the Enlightenment thinkers, when science and technology was on the rise, began to write about how we will eventually be able to figure everything out and through science and technology solve every problem. It's a worldview where the problem is a lack of knowledge and understanding, and the remedy is science and technology, right? Whereas the biblical worldview is one in which the problem is sin, right? It's much deeper than the stuff around us, and the remedy, of course, is Jesus Christ. And then the eschatology, of course, is where are we going? Well, in a secular sort of Silicon Valley worldview, it's a kind of post-millennialism that we will usher in sort of once we cure every disease and solve every problem. It's a religious vision. Whereas as Christians, we know, right, from the biblical story that God will one day wipe away every tear, the dead will be raised, and that the New Jerusalem comes down out of heaven. I think that's an important point. He doesn't subcontract the New Jerusalem to us, right? Kind of say, keep building towards it. No, the New Jerusalem comes down out of heaven. And what he calls us to, this is words by Lewis Smedes, he calls us to make some imperfect models of that perfect world to come. So we're called to be faithful signposts of that new creation. But we ourselves are not going to usher that in. That's the work of Jesus.
Yeah. So Derek, you're using a very traditional, like Reformed view of eschatology, right? Like it's God's work, and it's given, not built. I often will want to correct and gently correct my colleagues who, in their sermon or in a prayer, say we're going to build the kingdom of God. Help us build the kingdom of God. Yeah. Jesus never uses that language. He always says, enter and receive. Like it's never an act. And I want to hold space for that. But what if God is, and so now I'm sort of introducing something we're just getting into now, Brent and I, with Teilhard de Chardin and the Omega Point and this.
Oh yeah.
His alternative, what I would call an alternative eschatology to like what you and I were, and I still primarily hold to, but I'm testing the waters a little bit here. And Brent's last question, I think, hits home on that. Is what if the entering and receiving are these technological advancements? What if they're works of the Holy Spirit? Like I preached yesterday about the toilet and like as a technology of God's mercy, right?
Yeah.
Just think about the billions of people whose lives have been saved because of indoor plumbing. Like, so why not? Why couldn't it be that transhumanism, I'm just going to use that just sort of as a catch-all, is part of that entering and receiving, even though it's like us. I mean, we're co-creating with God, but it's God's spirit. Like I'm a cancer survivor. I think the medicine that I got and the like that was God's healing hand in my life. So why not? Why can't we transition there? And what if Teilhard is right? What if Calvin and our reform and Barth and our Reformed perspective is actually wrong? What if the new kingdom that's coming is delivered? And Teilhard, and this is I know I'm getting into this. I love this. What if Teilhard, when he talks about the eschaton, it's not like an end. It's like it's life after the end, right? Like it's, or N.T. Wright, like life after death. I know they're mixing metaphors, but like, so what if Teilhard's right? I mean, can you leave possibility for that, for a different eschatology?
Well, so I do think the builder and architect of the new heavens and new earth is God. But there's this curious verse, right, in Revelations 21, where the honor and glory of the nations will be brought into the New Jerusalem, right? That there is this. Richard Mouw has this wonderful little book called "When the Kings Come Marching In," right? And he says, there's these images in Isaiah 60 of Zion, right? The New Jerusalem, where there's flocks and herds and lumber. There's even the ships of Tarshish. He points to the ships of Tarshish, which are in the Bible symbols of pagan commercial power, but somehow they're there in Zion, right? And then of course this image of the kings coming marching in with the glory and honor of the nations. And so I think that it's entirely possible that some of our human artifacts will find their way into the New Jerusalem, but completely freed of sin, right? That there is this cosmic sort of crucible where all the dross will be removed and these things will appear. And I speculate with my students. I said, do you think there'll be computers in heaven, in the new heavens and new earth? And my students go, I don't think so. I say, well, what about harps? And they'll say, oh yeah, there'll be harps. Of course there'll be harps. And of course harps are a human cultural artifact, just like computers. And so I think we will see some things in the New Jerusalem that are familiar, but they will be things that God brings in and adds to what is already his New Jerusalem. And so my hope is that some of the works that we make together will survive the fires of judgment, but they will not be the foundation. They will not be the main object of the New Jerusalem, right? So I think that's a way of seeing human creativity, and then our work right now is a witness and an obedience to God's call that points to this new heaven and this new earth, which will have all the possibilities of this earth, I think. And so there's no reason why computers couldn't work in the new heavens and the new earth. That's speculative, but yeah.
Yeah, as someone looking forward to the day when I close my last spreadsheet, I hope that I'm not busting those out in the New Jerusalem. But I want to go down. You said your view of eschatology impacts what we choose and how we do today.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, do you see there, I come at this from a regular layperson. I'm a small business owner. I'm a dad of 3 young kids. I'm just kind of trying to figure it out and navigate my way through this era in which we find ourselves. Do you perceive there to be some choice that I need to make and people like me need to make between this Christian eschatological view and the Silicon Valley utopia view? And if so, what does that choice look like? What does it contain? What am I choosing between? And how does that impact how I live my life on a day-to-day, week-to-week in the next couple of years here?
Yeah.
Or is there not a choice?
No, I think that if you subscribe to this idea that it's up to us to usher in this new heaven and this new earth, that somehow we are the ones who will bring about utopia, then you're really putting a lot of your trust in your own efforts and your own abilities. I think there's something in Silicon Valley called accelerationism, which is this idea that if we can solve all of our problems, we have to move quickly and break things and move as quickly as possible towards AGI and all this other sort of stuff, because it is the reason people are dying right now, because we don't have the technology, and we need to move as fast as possible to unfold and usher in the technology that will solve all of these problems. If you read Mark Andreessen's article, AI will save the world. He says, wars will be ended and diseases will be cured. It's kind of like that biblical image of the new heavens and the new earth, where Jesus wipes away every tear and there's no more sorrow and no more sadness and death has passed away. It's an alternative vision. Whereas I think if we recognize the creational goodness of technology, the fact that it's intertwined with sin, that we are not the ones who will usher in the new heaven and the new earth, it provides a lot of humility, right? It's a more humble posture about our role and what we want to do instead in your business or in your technology, or my students in their work as computer scientists, is to be a faithful presence in the workplace, pointing to the reality of a coming kingdom, to try and build products and services that show love to our neighbors. And that is an opportunity to share the hope of the gospel. And like I said, I love these words of Lewis Smedes, that making some imperfect models of the perfect world to come, to kind of think, what should AI look like? What should my business do in order to help be a signpost of the shalom that's coming? I think that's what we're called to do, to be faithful in the meantime. Understanding that God is the architect and builder in the end.
Yeah, and making that practical for the layperson or the clergy person who's leading lay people, like what are the most tangible practical implications of that for us in our day-to-day lives as you see them in this next little phase that is to come?
Yeah, I think as churches, we need to instill that gospel story in people: the creation, the fall, redemption, new creation, so that we are animated and oriented towards that story, and not the rival stories that we're all surrounded with. Right? That it's so easy to kind of absorb in the surrounding culture. I think I think also the church can help remind us to cultivate spiritual disciplines. I think in our fast paced world where we're always plugged in and connected, it's easy to lose the time and space that we need to practice spiritual disciplines like prayer, devotions, silence, service, Sabbath. I think Sabbath is one of the harder things to do nowadays when we're constantly plugged in and we have devices in our pocket. And I think it's those practices. One of my colleagues, Jamie Smith, philosopher here at Calvin, has talked about that the importance of liturgies and rituals as kind of a shaping influence in our life that orients us towards the vision of the kingdom. And I think if we don't practice those kinds of things, if the church doesn't help us practice those kinds of things, we will be oriented to a rival version of the good life and a rival eschatology, a rival view. And I think that we will so easily absorb the cultural narratives that will that will draw us away from the gospel story. So I think the church is, and then the church also, right, can preach what it means to be human. You know, like John Calvin opens his institutes with, right, true knowledge is true knowledge of ourselves and true knowledge of God, and the church can remind us of that. We're made as image bearers of God. That Christ is a sort of our exemplar of the perfect image of God, and then understanding who God is and what we're called to do in this world. I mean, that's what we need to reorient ourselves in a technological society that has some very different competing narratives and makes, I think, promises that will ultimately disappoint.
Yeah, understood. Thank you. I have two more topics I want to hit, though I reserve the right to make that more than two. Um, Curious if you zoom out a little bit, what are
Hmm.
you optimistic and hopeful, excited about in this advancing technology era?
Yeah, I think, you know, a lot of people talk about doom and gloom about AI, and to be sure, misdirected technology will bring consequences. But AI has got some you know, nifty possibilities for drug discovery, for protein folding. I just saw something the other day about an AI stethoscope that can detect, you know, heart anomalies in seconds. You know, AI for medical imaging, AI to reduce traffic accidents, AI to increase crop yields. These are all applications of AI that continue to promote human flourishing. That Christians can eagerly get on board with, right? And AI, quite frankly, to translate the gospel and to spread the gospel message. I just had a talk at Calvin from SIL ministry, and they had some of their folks come to speak to our students about how they're using AI to translate the gospel into thousands of languages, and how that's being accelerated. I kind of joked with the students. I said, you know, a lot of people think AI will bring about the end of the world. And there is this verse in the gospel about first the gospel has to be preached to all nations and then the end will come. So maybe AI will help bring about the end, not not by ushering in a new heaven and a new earth, not through destruction, but maybe it'll help usher the end because it'll help spread the gospel, which has to first be spread to all nations before the end comes. And so
This
maybe
is like a Left Behind 2.0, is what you're
yes,
saying.
yeah, 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 exactly.
That's a new take. I haven't heard that one, but I mean, it makes logical sense.
Yeah.
Tracking with you. And then finally, I'm curious what encouragement or direction you would offer to any listeners who are tempted to explore either grief bots, digital avatars, or digital immortality projects.
Yeah. Yeah, I think if you're working out of a Christian space, we need to turn to the gospel and its promises and look to Jesus. I think even if we're not, for folks who are not Christians, I think there are creational realities and creational norms. If you go against sort of creational realities, it acts like rubber bands. It pushes back. H. Farmer once said that, if you go against the grain of the universe, you get splinters. And I think any attempt to try and solve the problem of grief with grief bots, or to substitute human connection for machine connection, or turn to something else in creation for our hope and for our trust, that there's going to be consequences. And I'm pretty convinced that over time the social sciences will begin to show the problems of turning to grief bots and chat bots. That this goes against sort of a creational norm of living in community with each other, and sort of facing the realities that we live in, and trying to find some artificial way of avoiding it or postponing it. I think I'm pretty convinced that there will be consequences, and so I would urge people, when they're faced by grief, as I was, to surround themselves with people who can encourage you and walk alongside you for joining grief groups in your area, especially those that have the hope of the gospel embedded in them as well, and to turn to your church family, and to turn to the gospel, and to read again, the promises of God for His people, and to zoom out and see the biblical story, the promise of a new heaven and a new earth, and the physical resurrection. We're not just going to be floating spirits in clouds playing harps. There's going to be a bodily resurrection, a new heaven and a new earth that we can look forward to, where every tear will be wiped away. So yeah, I would urge people not to try to take a technological shortcut to grief, because I think there'll be consequences for sure.
Amen. Derek, we are super grateful that you're on our podcast, but even more than that, your vulnerability, your humility, and the clarity of which you speak when it comes to the gospel is so encouraging, and I know it will be for our listeners. So thank you again for joining the New Garden podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Tony, what'd you think?
Number one, I just was so grateful for his vulnerability and rooting his theology, his vocation, his expertise when it comes to all things technological in humanity, like just in his story. And I was very grateful for that. I also found myself throughout the conversation really resonating with his lines, the strength of his lines. And I resonated the differentiation between someone and something. I wonder, though, I do wonder if there can be a reformed eschatology that is entered and received by God's grace. It's an activity of God, but through human hands and technological advancements. And I wonder if there's someone out there, maybe they're listening. Reach out to us. Tell us who you are, who has really developed some of that eschatological material to talk about. Because I get hung up, Brent, like, as a cancer survivor, his wife dies of cancer. Like, we want to do cancer research, for example. Like, no one would say we shouldn't do cancer research. But if you keep walking that line and you cure this cancer and you cure this disease and you cure that, like, eventually, Kurzweil, he mentioned Kurzweil in the conversation, eventually you're going to get to the place that the only reason you'll die is because of mishap or accident. And maybe that's not the eschaton, but like, he was very strong on, yep, we have to die. Like, we have to die. And I get why. I mean, I understand it. I mean, that's the difference between us and God, right? Like, God is eternal. We are temporal. But then we have this story that is also about everlasting life and new creation. So I don't know. There's a lot. I imagine like Pong in my head. Like, speaking of ancient technologies, like just like a back and forth in my heart and my head as he was talking about. Is that where we should draw the line? Yeah. What were your thoughts?
It strikes me that drawing the line is not something that the market economy and the world that we live in does well. And in theory, you could say that's the role of faith and a religious tradition to find where that line is. But saying like, yeah, you can go this far and then stop that's always going to be challenging, and people are going to be pushing the envelope. I think what hopped out to me was the word receiving the kingdom of God. And it's almost this right balance that we want to strike, where obviously we have been given so many tools to be co-creators of the universe in our experience with God. But that doesn't mean we're the sole creators. Like, at best, we're the co-creators. Yeah. And so if we think it's all up to humans, we have to do it all, move fast and break things. I appreciated him introducing accelerationism. Then that risks getting out of balance with the natural order and the God-given reality of our death. And in another context recently, someone was talking in a group I'm in about receiving and this yin and yang. And if you come to it from a yin yang perspective, there's this balance of being and receiving with being out there and doing. And if you don't have yin in your life, then they said there's a lot of empty yang. There's a lot of doing that's not fruitful, that's at best not fruitful, at worst quite destructive. And so if we get this, it's all up to us. We must do, we must go, but we lose the muscle to discern and to receive and to cultivate softness and love and human interpersonal connection, because we're so busy racing to look at multiple different screens and download our technology and do an everlasting bot. Then we'll lose some of the elements of what it does mean to be human and does mean to have this embodied experience that's a gift from God.
Yeah, I wonder too. Like, and I regret not asking this question.
Season 2.
Yeah, season 2. I wish I would have asked like about people 200 years ago or 150 years during the Industrial Revolution. You know, the genesis of the Industrial Revolution, and like the same kind of like, we're going to lose our humanity. We're going to, like, how did Christian, aren't we just replaying the same story of progress? And it conflicts, I think, in a lot of ways with traditional eschatological like concepts, like that we're going to till and steward and care for the earth and human flourishing, but one day it's just like boom, it's all gone. Jesus is going to come back, establish a new heaven, new earth, and he kept saying this, and I love this image that in the middle, it's going to be a new city. It's going to be, well, a city is a technological advancement. And he asked a question about computers. Of course computers are going to be there. If it's going to be a city, unless I don't know what a city is, right? There's going to be buildings, and right, you follow me on that? So like, I don't know how we can draw. I understand why, for humility, idolatry, all of that, why we draw these lines. But at the same time, like I have yet to be convinced that technological advancement can't be the eschaton, can't be the future that is coming for all eternity. Like I'm not convinced that that's not a possibility.
Yeah, I feel like that's some version of that is the animating question for each of us in doing this podcast, and why it rises to this level of, there's, Derek articulated, there's different stories. There's the traditional Christian Reformed story. There's the Silicon Valley kind of technology-oriented story. Can those be compatible? Can those be integrated? Or is that not possible to integrate those two? And then I also wonder, can that traditional Christian story still be the story that carries the day and has the moral high ground and kind of galvanizing, unifying potential in this modern time? Or do you have to integrate it with the tech reality that is so becoming the water in which we swim and the way that we live regularly for it to be relevant in 2025 through 2075?
Yeah. And I want to go back to, if we can, like the very beginning of the podcast where we're talking about grief. And for our listeners, Brent really framed this episode super well, and I think is resonant and relevant. Thinking about AI and thinking about grief and this impulse to want to have the chatbots, to want to have avatars. I mentioned my dad. Like, I would love for my dad to have a conversation with my son who's going to be married in less than a year, to talk about marriage, to talk about faith, to talk about life. I'm keenly aware of my own sort of desire in that, right? And like, I want our listeners to tap into that desire that they also have, or they may be feeling. And I think it is good that he tempers us a little bit. And it was interesting, C.S. Lewis, I was unprompted or unscripted rather. I just thought of that, like this sort of incest, this sort of like, I've created something that is not the actual person. And yet I so like, oh gosh, I like, if I could have my dad on this call, like on this podcast with us, like I would be like, yeah, let's do it. Let's do it. And so like this anthropological sort of, I loved how he was like, let's identify our humanity in all of this. And I think regardless of where we end up with eschatology, like naming our humanity, our desires, our wants, and putting them under the sovereignty of God, regardless if we come out in different places eschatologically, on how technology does or doesn't play into that, is so important. Like I've really appreciated him honoring that emotion and that feeling and that desire.
Yeah, so many times over these podcast episodes, we've talked about, if people do this thing, it might be bad for them. And one voice in the back of my head keeps coming back to, well, that's something that people might choose to do. And I went on a walk this morning and I was really trying to center with this topic. And I was imagining my wife being dead. And I was thinking...
You didn't tell her that, right?
She knows we're recording this episode today. But I really dropped in on, if I had a digital record of her, I would know that it wasn't her. But on a Friday night, I might still rather be like, here's what Lou did at preschool this week. Yeah. He would have been so proud of her. I might still rather choose that as my entertainment, call it that, my way of spending my discretionary time in my life, than like going to an Atlanta United game. Like it might just touch something in me and I might freely choose it. And I totally still get why Derek said that is a harmful substitute. It can become an addicting and empty calorie substitute. It's like Harry Potter when they're looking at the mirror of their loved ones and they forget to actually be out in the world. But I still think I would choose it. Like, I think I would know that and be like, okay, but like it's still compared to some of the substitutes gonna like feel better for me. And so I think people will make that choice because it touches such a raw human emotion and felt need. It's gonna be tricky to navigate, man.
Well, and in that experience, and thanks for sharing it that way. I mean, in that experience, even though it's a machine, you are experiencing your own humanity as well. Like, so that's where I don't want to discard that. And I appreciate what he's saying about like that's fraudulent. It's not the real thing. But what I'm feeling is real. What I'm experiencing and in what you would experience telling her about what Lou did during school that day is a real thing. It's real words, it's real emotion, it's real. So that's where I want to leave space for that. And I understand the harms. I get it. Somebody may never leave their screen and lose human interactions. But what if that interaction prompts in you, what if the chat bot, like whatever that is, and your spouse says back to you, she says, Brent, thanks for sharing that. I'm so proud of you as a dad, and I want you to keep progressing through your grief. Find a small group, find, people to talk to. Maybe find a new maybe there's a time where it's like, hey, find a new spouse, find a new partner, right? Like, you've grieved, and now it's time to move on, right? I mean, or keep moving through, but you know what I'm saying. Like, could we not engineer that? Like, could that not be a possibility? That it helps us move towards humanity by recognizing our own needs and wants and emotions in that space. Like, so, yeah, I don't want to dismiss that out of hand. And I think Derek makes a compelling case, but I'm not ready to give up on that yet. And maybe that's just what Calvin would call my depravity, like my longing to have something satiate my deepest needs outside of God. And maybe it is, maybe it isn't.
Yeah, I really appreciate your ability to bring those topics with a degree of unknowing and to shine them up to the light.
Yeah, there is a great deal of mystery. And I liked what in one of our previous podcasts about what Bob Johansson says about the ring. Like, there has to be some elasticity for us to try this out. But there are these stanchions that hold the ring in place. And I think that's what we're trying to do now, like in this podcast. Like, how can we experiment and innovate with these technologies while still holding? Now, for Derek, maybe one of the stanchions that holds the ring in place is this, never created chat or a grief chatbot. Maybe that is, but maybe for someone else, it's the sovereignty of God. It's a little higher level, and I don't know. I don't want to give up on that. I don't want to give up on the possibility of God's grace and mercy. Like working through indoor plumbing for the flourishing of human life, I don't want to give up on the grief bot.
Yeah. And also, we've talked so much about Christianity and modern culture. If grief bots are something that 9 out of 10 people are using, can the Christian stance be, no,
Yeah.
we draw the line at grief bots? Or do you go along with it because everyone goes along with it? That's a little bit of a...
Yeah, my hunch is just what I know about the church, because nobody wants to be Amish. I mean, that was, with all due respect to my Amish friends, who are people who are born outside of that community, aren't readily choosing that way of being Christian in the world, is what I mean to say. I did not want to come off as sounding disrespectful to that way of being Christian. But you rarely see somebody leaving the modern world and entering into that space. So Christianity, from the printing press, I mean, when Gutenberg created the printing press, you know why he wanted to do it? He wanted to make more Bibles. That's what he wanted to do. He wasn't like thinking about books. I mean, in the secular sense, he was like, I want to make more Bibles, and like we adopt to that technology, right? The church comes around to it. So I don't know. Maybe one day in 2075, we'll be all worshiping with neural networks, and I'm feeling your grief, and you're feeling my grief, and we've got wristbands that send, pulses over our bodies, and maybe that is a way that we're going to commune with God or share our grief together,
And his AI spreads the gospel to all nations. Tickling line of logic. It's like, all right, well, what if in that grief bot process, to your point, where it nudges you to find a small group or otherwise, what if part of that nudge is, hey, people tend to process this best when they have a relationship with a higher power? Is that something that you've cultivated? Mm-hmm. Like, if not, maybe who's someone in your life that you could reach out to and ask these questions? And maybe that's an entree. Maybe that's an entryway to somebody making a connection with God that they wouldn't have otherwise. Yeah. So the great news is that God will work through it, whether or not Tony and I figure out that God's going to work.
Yeah, and I think the best end of time is line. And I love he kept referencing Revelation 21. It's one of my favorite texts, 1-5. New heaven, new earth coming down. Tears will be no more. Death will be no more. God makes God's home with mortals forevermore. But in Corinthians, when Paul talks about the eschaton, that, the last things and the future of God, he says God will be all in all. And I think regardless of where we come out on that, like that line that God will be all in all should be our North Star, should be as we move towards this. Does this embrace this truth that God will be all in all, or does it diminish it? And I think that we probably could all agree on, regardless of where we come out on grief bots. Yeah, great episode, Brent. Thanks for shaping it the way you did.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Thank you. Appreciate it. That's all we have today for the New Garden episode. As always, thank you for journeying with us. Thank you for your questions, your feedback. Please be sure to give this a like, a follow, subscribe, share this with anyone in your life you think would find this conversation on AI, grief, immortality, and resurrection compelling. And we look forward to seeing you for future episodes.
The New Garden is a production of First Presbyterian Church of Atlanta. Produced by Tim Haney. Executive producer, Mark Wallace McGuire. Music by Sindhu Geed.
Seeing eyes swallowed by their pride. Night is taken day. Where's your God? Says your God. Only picture perfect latitudes thrown around. Holding fast when everyone's gone. Can't you see we're running out of breath? It's time to leave and head on. We're the ones with scars, broken, dying time.